Hopefully you can hear me. I think, yeah, we are all set here. I am Nelson Garcia. I am the managing director for GE Healthcare at the Brazilian operation. So I'm speaking here out of São Paulo, from São Paulo to you. First of all, it's a great honor to have you all here. So, muito obrigado, muchas gracias. Thank you very much for your presence here. The idea for us to create this webinar series, it's because of you, because we understand on these difficult times that we are living, this kind of connection and spreading education through all over. It's a mission of our company. And today it's a very special day because the webinar, it is, the name of the webinar is Will Strain 3D be the future to access the left? I will be introducing now Dr. Luigi Badano. Many of you know already the reputation of Professor Badano. He is the director of cardiovascular imaging unity at IRCCS. He's also a professional of cardiology at the University of Milano. He's member of the Italian Society of Cardiology, European Association of Cardiovascular Imaging, also member of the American College of Cardiology, among other institutions that he is member, an active member of those. He also published 9 books, and together with Dr. Luigi Badano, we have here Dr. Jorge Lowstein. Dr. Jorge, it's our advisor for this webinar series of cardiology in GE Healthcare. We also have here Ariel Deceno. Ariel, it's our cardiovascular clinical manager for Latin America. Just before I pass the word to Dr. Luigi Badano, I would like to say that here at the Zoom, you have the Q&A button. So you can type your questions at any time. It can be in local language, Spanish, Portuguese. Also, if you like to do in English, it's fine as well. So put your question, and by the end, Dr. Jorge Lowstein will be moderating the questions and answers from Dr. Luigi Badano. So Dr. Luigi, as I said before, privilege and honor for me and for our company, GE Healthcare, to have you here giving us more information and education about this so important team. Thank you very much, Dr. Badano.
Thank you, Nelson, Ariel. A special thank you to Professor Jorge Lowenstein and all the friend and all the colleague in the echocardiography. This is one of the ways that we can be in touch during the COVID times, and I really appreciate the opportunity offered by GE to be with the South American friends once again. Tonight we will discuss about the 3D strain, if it is a feasible tool to assess the left ventricular function. First of all, I would like to share with you a concept that it's the most important one when we are talking about strain, and it is the difference between the ejection fraction, that is just the displacement of the endocardium. So it's a chamber, a parameter of a chamber function, but it doesn't tell anything to us what is happening into the myocardium, because as you know, the ejection fraction is affected by many other determinants like the preload and the afterload conditions, the heart rate, and finally the contractility of the myocardium. So it's important to have this relatively new echo technique, that is the deformation imaging, that allows directly to assess the function of the myocardium. And we will see that in many instances, the function of the chamber provided by the EF is not exactly the chamber of the myocardium that we can assess with the strain. 2D strain has become very popular, and there are a lot of publications of 2D strain every year in the international literature, but also, and even more important, 2D strain has entered the clinical arena, and it has become one of the fundamental parameters that we measure in modern echocardiography. However, 2D strain has its own limitations that we should be aware when we use this technology. Just to go back briefly to the basics, you know that we are looking at the motion of a group of those speckles that are these brilliant dots that are created by the interference of the ultrasound beam with the myocardiocytes, and they are taken together in units that are called the kernel, and the software just identifies one of those kernels, and it is supposed to be able to follow the motion of the kernel throughout the cardiac cycle. As you see here, the position at the beginning of the contraction, and then the position at the end of the contraction. This distance divided by the time at which the contraction occurs provided the deformation. However, the problem is that we are talking about a tomographic technique that is a two-dimensional echocardiography. That means that we are looking just at very thin slices of the myocardium. And so it's unlikely that a group of speckles can stay into the plane of those tomographic slides throughout the cardiac cycle. And so the fact that the speckles move linearly exactly in the plane of the echocardiographic view is not respected. Indeed, they exit the plane after a few frames to move freely into the space. And this is the great advantage of three-dimensional echocardiography, where we are not looking just at the thin slices of myocardium, but we are looking at three-dimensional chunks of myocardium in which the speckles are free to move in any direction, and we can follow their motion from the very beginning in diastole to their final position during systole. Another limitation of the 2D speckle tracking is not of the technique itself, but the fact that with the two-dimensional echocardiography, we very often are foreshortening the apical views, that one or more of the apical views that we are using to measure the strain. And when we are foreshortening them, there are consequences on the final computation. This is a very recent paper that comes from the strain standardization group in Leuven, showing that when you use the foreshortening views, the FS, the value of the strain is significantly higher than when you use optimally aligned images. And this is particularly evident for the apical segments, where you have the highest variation from optimally aligned views with the foreshortening views. Another important difference that has been shown in this paper is that the effect of the foreshortening on the final computation of the strain depends very much on the software package that you use. They compare the two software packages, the GE and the TomTech. Is not just the name, but it's the approach, because GE is actually looking at the motion of the speckles at the entire myocardial wall, while the TomTech is just looking at the shortening of the endocardial layer. And indeed, GE is less affected by the foreshortening of the views than the TomTech or the other software packages that are using just the endocardial shortening. And finally, another big limitation of the conventional 2D echocardiography, this is not just for the longitudinal strain, but particularly for the circumferential and the radial, is that we are measuring the change from systole to diastole in these thin slices. But the position of these thin slices are fixed in space during the cardiac cycle. However, particularly when we are dealing with the base of the left ventricle, as you see here, there is quite a substantial shortening of the ventricle. So the myocardium that is encompassed by the slice at the end of the diastole is not anymore the myocardium that is encompassed by the slice during systole. This is something that can be circumvented by the 3D echo because we don't have fixed slices anymore, but we can have the dynamic basal volume that adapts to the shortening of the cavity during systole. So we will have always the same myocardium that is encompassed by our cut planes and in diastole and in systole. So there are a lot of technical issues with the two-dimensional speckle tracking that can be circumvented and overcome by the 3D speckle tracking. And so we will start to look at how it works. So we are not looking at anymore in areas, so kernels with these speckles, but we are looking at the cubes of speckles. And this cube of speckles are identified in the endodiastolic frame, as you see here, the red dots. And then in the subsequent frames throughout the systole, this green block of speckles is searched among many others in the same area. And when it is identified, its position of the block is detected to the different frames and the displacements of the blocks is followed. This is the block matching algorithm. These are the basic principles of how it works, the 3D strain. When you have it, how to do it, it's relatively simple. When you have a 3D data set, you define a region of interest, the ROI, that is limited by the two green lines that you see are encompassing the myocardium of the left ventricle throughout the length, but also throughout the entire circumference of the left ventricle. So we don't have any more slices, but we have the entire myocardium of the ventricle that is searched, and it is quantitated. And indeed, one of the major differences between two-dimensional and three-dimensional strain is that the two-dimensional strain is just one number, that is the mathematical average of the peak value of the strain of each myocardial segment. Here it's a dynamic strain, so we are looking at the strain values at each time during the cardiac cycle. You see those numbers, how fast they are changing, because they are following this red line that shows you the value of the strain at every single frame during the cardiac cycle. And then you can reconstruct your polar map that you can fix in one single time. For example, the end systole, as you see here in the bullseye, but you can also have a dynamic one with a surface rendering and with a parametric display of the values of the strain on the Beutel of the left ventricle. Here is the concept of the dynamic strain. The timing during the cardiac cycle is shown by this red line. ED is end diastole, ES is end systole, and you see that for the longitudinal strain, how those numbers changes gradually throughout the cardiac cycle. So with the 3D strain, we can actually identify a more physiological number that is the actual strain at that particular frame during the cardiac cycle. Another advantage is that all the components of the myocardial deformation can be assessed simultaneously, and so we don't have any more the discrepancy due to the fact that you have to use the apical views to assess the longitudinal strain, the parasternal short axis views for the circumferential and the radial with the different timing during the acquisition. Here we have one single data set of the left ventricle from which we can derive the longitudinal strain, the circumferential strain, and the radial strain in the same cardiac beat. And then we have one more, and it is the area strain. This doesn't exist in the conventional two-dimensional spectral tracking. It's peculiar of a 3D strain. The area strain is a composite strain that takes into account the circumferential and the longitudinal component of the myocardial deformation. You should imagine it as a sort of area in the mid-myocardium, and we are looking how this area changes, shrinks in both the longitudinal and circumferential component during the cardiac cycle. So we have an area at n times during the cardiac cycle, and the area strain will be this area at this time n minus the area at end diastole, the largest one, divided by the area at end diastole. So it's a sort of composite parameter of the deformation, taking into account the two of the components. And also another big advantage of using 3D datasets to look at the mechanics of the left ventricle is that we can really measure the torsion of the left ventricle. You know that with the 2D spectral tracking, we are just looking at the rotation of the base of the heart, the rotation of the apex of the heart, and the difference between the two provide the twisting of the left ventricle. And this is sometimes confused with the torsion, but to have the torsion, we need to know the distance between the apical and the basal views. That is impossible to know in two-dimensional echocardiography. In three-dimensional echocardiography, we know exactly the position of the cut plane, both the basal and the apical cut plane, so we can measure this distance, and this will provide the true rotation of the left ventricle that it's becoming more and more interesting in different cardiac conditions. This is how it is displayed when it's measured in degrees divided by the centimeters of the length of the ventricle, and is shown in this graph. 3D speckle tracking is a technique that has been around for a few years, not exactly in the routine of the clinical echo lab, and we will see why. First of all, we had a few validation studies, just a couple of them with the experimental setting. So looking at comparing the deformation measured with the 3D echocardiography with that measured with the sonomicrometry in the instrumented ship heart. And SEO and co-workers found very good correlations of the 3D longitudinal, circumferential strain, radial strain, sorry, in these instrumented ships, but we have to identify the fact that sorry, that they looked only at the anterior wall of the left ventricle. All the other validation study that we have doesn't have a real gold standard, but they compared the findings at the 3D strain with the different surrogated standards that may be the CMR tagging, the 2D LVF, 3D LVF, or the feature tracking at the CMR. However, all those studies provided very good correlations with the different standards. The real problem is that except the sonomicrometry in the instrumented experimental animal, we don't have a real clinical reference to test the 3D echocardiography. Potential clinical application, of course, this new technique, for all the reasons that we have discussed so far, has raised a lot of interest in the researchers. So it has been used in many clinical conditions, from ischemic heart disease, subclinical left ventricular dysfunction, distinguishing physiological versus pathological hypertrophy, monitoring cardiac toxicity in patients assuming potentially cardiotoxic drugs, cardiomyopathies to assess the prognosis of the synchrony. There are a lot of papers. I cannot review all of them, but the problem is that all the researchers tried to address if there is a real advantage in using 3D deformation imaging compared with the 2D speckle tracking. I will show a few examples just to start how it appears on 3D strain different diseases. We will start with one of the most frequent diseases that we have in the echo lab, ischemic heart disease. This is a patient with a previous anterior MI. You see the wall motion abnormalities in the anterior wall and in the anterior septum. And here is the 3D strain assessment, and here is the eyeball, the bull-eye display of the numbers. You will see when looking at the bull-eye display with the 3D echocardiography that you don't have those striking difference that we are used to have in 2D speckle tracking. This is inherent to the technique. We have discussed before that with the 3D strain, we are looking at the instantaneous value of the strain of the segments. So the difference between the segments is much less than when you look just at the peak values independent on the time they occur with the 2D echocardiography. This is the reason why we don't have those evident bull-eye, because the gradient between the normal and abnormal is less outstanding. As we will see in a moment in another patient, This is a patient with the previous myocardial infarction. You see the echinesis and the hyper echo-reflectivity of the inferior wall over here in the Musi slice data set. Here you have the 3D assessment of the volume. You see the akinesis of the inferior wall, but the ejection fraction is still preserved. However, when we go and look at the 3D strain components, this is the longitudinal strain. You see the it's minus 18, and you see that this is the area of reduced contraction. That is much better delineated by the area strain than by the longitudinal strain. And this is one of the advantages of this new parameter, because it's putting together the longitudinal and the circumferential strain seems to be more sensitive in detection of myocardial abnormalities. This is how we see the bullseye of the longitudinal strain and circumferential strain, and this is how it will appear, the 2D speckle tracking in the same patient. You see here, you see much clearer the abnormality in the inferior septum and the inferior wall, and also in the posterolateral wall, that are not so evident if you don't look at the actual numbers when you are using the 3D strain. Another area where strain is really important and that is always used as a pathognomic to show the discrepancy between the chamber function and the myocardial function is the amyloidosis. This is a restrictive cardiomyopathy in which the longitudinal deformation of the myocardium is preeminently affected. So this is clearly a dysfunctioning left ventricle. However, if you look at just the ejection fraction measurement, this is at the lower limits of normality. But if we go and look at the deformation, we see that it's severely impaired, -7 the longitudinal strain, and -19 the area strain. And you can also show the typical apical sparing on your dynamic Boiter shown in the longitudinal as well as in the area strain. But once again, this is nice, but not as nice as we are used to see with the 2D speckle tracking. And once again, the reason is that because this is a physiological measurement, so the gradient between the normal functioning and the dysfunctioning segments is not as much as it is when you look just at the peak values. Just to show the advantages of the 3D strain, I will report this important paper by the group in Japan. They look at the patients at the myocardial mechanics in patients with severe aortic stenosis, despite being asymptomatic. And they showed that when they measured the longitudinal strain using 3D data set, the difference between those who had major cardiac events in the follow-up was much larger than when using the 2D longitudinal strain. This is an example from our database, a 70-year-old woman, completely asymptomatic despite she was sedentary, has a severe aortic stenosis with an aortic valve area of 0.8 centimeters squared, high gradients, as you can see in this view, normal flow and a normal ejection fraction. When you look at the 2D speckle tracking, you have a mild reduction at the lower level of normality, -17.8, but when you look at the 3D strain, this is moderately reduced, it is -13. And the difference here is just because here there is this foreshortening of the apex that provided a false high value of the deformation. Indeed, just 2 weeks after the performance of the echo, the patients developed the symptoms during an exercise stress test, showing that the 3D speckle tracking was much more sensitive in detecting the myocardial dysfunction. Looking at the prognostic value, also in the general population of patients referred to the echo lab, this is an important paper by the group in Chicago by Roberto Lang. The first author was Dr. Medvedovsky, showing that in those unselected patients, the prognostic value of the 2D longitudinal strain was very good, but the one of 3D longitudinal strain was even better, and particularly in those with mild reduction and moderate reduction that are much easier distinguished in their outcome compared with the 2D longitudinal strain. Those are the good news, but there are also areas of concerns that should be briefly discussed in order to have a complete overview of the actual status of the technique. And particularly the main area of concern is the need of really good image quality to have a perfect assessment of the 3D strain, the feasibility that is not higher than 85% in consecutive patients. We needed reference ranges, but now we have it, and I will show you. We have to discuss about the temporal resolution and the reproducibility of the technique. You see that sometimes it's very difficult to accommodate the entire ventricle, particularly the apical segments inside of the pyramidal data sets. Luckily, now the GE has this way to enlarge the apex on the new E95 that has solved many of those problems. I talked about the reference ranges. They were provided for the first time by our group in 2014. This is the work of Denise Muraro that assessed more than 260 healthy volunteers, perfectly normal, that were scanned using the E9 at that time, and then analyzed with the auto LVQ software to provide volumes, EF, left ventricular mass, and also the 3D strain. We showed that, and we confirmed the fact that the feasibility of the 3D strain is lower than of a 2D strain. 2D strain is quite feasible, and in our hands is around 95%. But with the 3D strain, we had 90% in healthy subjects selected for good acoustic window, and just 83% in consecutive patients coming to the echo lab. And the main problems were related to the poor acoustic window, the presence of arrhythmias that precluded the acquisition of a multi-beat full volume of the left ventricle, the problem of the incomplete visualization of the apical segments that were out of the pyramid, and then the tracking problems that are affecting the basal segment of the left ventricles. As you see in this bullseye, you see that many problems we had in the apical segments and the inferolateral segments, basal segments. The problem of the apex we have discussed about, the difficult to accommodate the entire apex into the data set using the E9. But for the basal problem is that because these basal segments are far away from the probe, and we have a high decorrelation of the speckles in that areas. However, Denisa was able to obtain values in a quite high number of patients, 150 women and 115 men. And by the simultaneous assessment of all the strain components, she showed that in normal subject there is a shift in the mechanics of the left ventricle that during the aging process is decreasing gradually the longitudinal function by increasing simultaneously the circumferential one at the scope of maintaining the stroke volume. The 3D strain values were affected by many parameters, particularly age and gender. As we have seen, women have higher strain values than men, but also the size of the ventricle, the presence of hypertrophy, but particularly the image quality and the temporal resolution were the main determinants of the strain values. It's important to look at the image quality and particularly for the temporal resolution. We don't need with the 3D echo high temporal resolution as we need for the 2D speckle tracking, because as we discussed, with the 2D speckle tracking, the speckle stays into the cut plane just for a few frames, and then we need to make a mathematical interpolation to identify the position at the end of systole. Here we have the 3D volume of the myocardium, so we can follow the position we can identify the position of the speckles of the blocks throughout the cardiac cycle. So there is no point to increase the temporal resolution, also because if you increase the temporal resolution, you will reduce the number of scan lines for each volume that you acquire, and you will degrade the quality of the images and reduce the feasibility of the 2D strain. These findings were also confirmed by the group of Tom Marwick and Negishi, and they showed, they confirmed once again that the 2D longitudinal strain is more feasible than 3D longitudinal strain, but they also showed that the best quality of the data set are those with a temporal resolution between 34 and 50 volumes seconds, and those are the ones where you have the best correlation between the 2D and the 3D strain. And by the way, this was exactly the best combination that we found in our experimental study, showing that among all the combination, the one where we have the best correlation of 3D versus 2D longitudinal strain, where when we are around 40 volumes per second. These findings were also confirmed in the experimental study in silicon data sets. The group of Hjertas in Norway shown that the most accurate results in this experimental setting were when you acquired 6 beats and you are around 40 volumes per second. So if you are interested in normal values, you can find them in the paper, but also in the GE strain white paper that has been produced by Denisa in 2014. You have all the technical details on how to acquire, how to analyze with the 3D strain and also the normal values. Another problem that we discovered with the 3D strain is about the intervendor differences. You know that this was an issue with the 2D strain, and we also checked with the 3D, just compared the two machine GE versus Toshiba that at that time were able to provide the 3D strain. And we found that these values were quite similar when we talk about the longitudinal strain, but for all the other strain components, the circumferential, radial, and area strain, the differences are absolutely striking. And for some components like the radial, it seems that the machine works on the two different scales. This is also the case when you examine the same data set with the two different software packages. One is the vendor specific, this is the EcoPack for the data set acquired with the GE, but when you use the same data set with the vendor independent for the function that is the software, once again, you have very similar results about the 3D longitudinal strain, but when you look at the other components, the circumferential, the radial, you have completely different numbers that are not similar. There are reasons for that they have been explained in this very nice editorial by Jens-Uwe Vogt, that is mainly due to the fact that those software are really working in a different way, because the GE software is looking at the entire myocardial wall and is assessing the deformation at the mid wall, while the Tomtec and Toshiba software are just looking at the shortening on the endocardial line. And you see that the position where you look at the shortening is absolutely determinant on the final results that you have. So look at what you are using. This is a very recent meta-analysis of all the normal values that have been produced. You see that there are close to 4,000 healthy subjects, and you see that looking at the different values, the GE and Toshiba are measuring lower values in general than the Tomtec, particularly for the GLS. Then GE is always lower than Toshiba and Tomtec that are measuring the myocardium for the circumferential, while they are quite similar on the radial strain. And here you see your values. So just to finish, we should pay attention to not comparing values that are acquired with the different machines, because the different machines have different values that cannot be compared. And this is one of the issues that we are currently. So just to conclude, I would say that hope that I have been able to share with you some concepts that definitely 3D echo is very promising, because it's a more physiological, objective, comprehensive, and reproducible quantitation of the mechanics of the left ventricle. So the values that we obtain with the 3D strain cannot be interchanged with those obtained with the 2D strain. There are issues that we have to take into account: the dependence on the good apical acoustic window and regular cardiac rhythm, because we need the multi-beat data set of the left ventricle. And then we need still a lot of research. And this was also the statement that we provided in this document jointly between the American Society Echo and the European Association, that 3D echo is really promising, but we need still validation and testing before it can become routinely used in the echo technique. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Professor Badano. I'm sure that all of us enjoy your lecture. It was a fantastic lecture, very conceptual, practical, and congratulations. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Jorge.
We have some questions. We have 15 to 20 minutes. So you can answer this question, please. The first, the definition of end systole in 3D strain is the same than in 2D strain?
Yes, definitely. And the algorithm uses the same approach, looking at the change at the minimum volume of the cavity. Sometimes we needed to correct it, and particularly when we are dealing with extremely dysfunctioning left ventricle, particularly when there is a left bundle branch. And usually I like to look at the motion of the mitral valve as the most sensitive and reliable mechanical marker of the end systole.
Okay. From Mexico is a question: could we have a cutoff value of strain, of global longitudinal strain, to make a definition about dysfunction, low, medium, or severe dysfunction?
So far we have just defined what is normal and what is abnormal. That was not that easy, as you have seen, but the grading of the severity of the dysfunction has not been provided so far.
Okay. Why there is an underestimation of values in 3D when we compare with 2D? There is an underestimation. Why?
It's not an underestimation, but as I tried to explain in the first part of my presentation, it's a different way of looking at the strain. So with the 2D strain, it's just a mathematical average of the peak values of each segment of the left ventricle, independent on the time they occur. With the 3D strain is an instantaneous average. So not necessarily all the segments have reached the peak. And so the number is necessarily lower with the 3D than when we look at the 2D.
Yes, here is a question. You explained that, but I will repeat it. How many frames or volumes do you need for 4D strain? And if you change it with tachycardia or in children, if you change the
so first of all, I have no experience in children, and as far as I know, there is no specific testing in children. In adults, we use a volume rate between 30 and 40. It's the optimal one, because it's enough for an accurate measurement of the motion of the blocks, but also provides a good image quality. In patients with tachycardia, I don't know really. I have not compared that, so I cannot answer. I can guess that since the tachycardia is mainly shortening the diastolic period and not affecting so much the systolic period, you don't need to change it very much.
Okay. Which is the normal value for area strain?
Area strain is about 30%.
Okay. From Peru is another question. There is a gradient from apex to base. That is for 2D and 3D the same. Why is the gradient? What do you think?
It's related to the curvature of the segments. And at the apex, there is a very high curvature of the segments, and so the shortening, the same contraction provides a higher shortening than in the segments of the base that are more rectilinear.
Could be that the base has more stress the wall. That could be that it is a lower value because the wall has less stress.
As more stress because the curvature is lower.
Yes, more stress in the base.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry, more stress in the base than in the
Yes.
apex. That could be another reason.
Yes, it's related to the curvature.
Okay, this is a personal question. Do you think that the 17th segment called the 17 is a true segment? In our dissection, it is a very thin layer. It's a real deformation of the 17th segment. It's real the deformation because in our dissection, the apex, the true apex, is very thin.
Yes, probably, Jorge, you remember how these 17th segments came out in the original work of Cerqueira when there was this attempt to standardize the segmentation across the different non-invasive imaging modalities. And so this problem was raised by nuclear cardiology, where they can see an hypoperfusion of this apical cap that doesn't exist in any other imaging modality like echo, CMR, or CT. This is just an issue of the nuclear cardiology.
Yes. Thank you so much for your presentation, say from Costa Rica. Dr. Badano, is there any 3 postsystolic index in 3D as in 2D strain?
That's a very good question, and I never checked that, but I don't remember in the EchoPack there is a postsystolic. If you can go on with the other questions, I will check immediately.
Another question. In which clinical scenarios 3D strain is superior to 2D strain?
Well, so far it's not been defined, let me say, because despite all these technological advantages that seems to have a 3D compared with the 2D strain, still 2D works very well in most of the conditions. I would say that the only real condition when we have an advantage is in patients that where you have a foreshortening of the left ventricle in a 2D. In those cases, you have an overestimation of the strain that can be misleading, and this is easily overcome by the 3D strain. Then the other conditions, most of the studies in ischemic heart disease, but they have not been able to show any real advantage. For example, in identifying transmural ischemia from non-transmural and so on, the prognostic advantages are really, really very small so far. But the technology is improving, feasibility is improving definitely, and so I think that in the near future we will see more and more data on the 3D strain.
Is there a cutoff number for the diagnostic of myocardial fibrosis with 3D strain?
No one I am aware of.
The normal value of torsion and rotation for 4D strain, could you repeat it? Is the same as with 2D?
To be honest, I don't think that no one has reported the normal torsion. Also because the reproducibility of the torsion is still a real issue. And I'm just aware of a couple of very small studies reporting the torsion, but I'm not sure it is the normal values. Let me go back a little bit on the presentation to see if Denisa has put them into the white paper of GE, but I don't think so, to be honest. No, indeed. You see that it is just reporting the
yes. Congratulations.
So just to answer the question of our friends from Costa Rica, I made a very quick 3D strain while talking with you, but I cannot see the post-systolic strain as an output.
Okay. It's another question from Costa Rica too about the 17th segment.
Yes.
Is it strain value the mean value of 4 apical segment, or is an independent strain value specific for this particular segment, as in 2D strain?
No, we don't consider the 17 segments both in 2D and in 3D strain. We usually have these 4 segments report.
Okay. Application of 3D strain on stress echo. Too difficult? A dream? What do you think about it?
No, I think that it's a very good application, provided that you have a good acoustic window, because you know that you cannot provide contrast, otherwise you will impair all your calculation. But in patients where the acoustic window is good, I like to use 3D echo to perform the stress echo. We have also published a paper about that. And in those patients, as it is with the 2D speckle tracking, when we perform the conventional 2D stress echo, we always analyze also the strain component. And in many times when you are in doubt, you don't have a clear normal or a clear echinacea, you are in doubt, sometimes the results of the 3D strain helps you to look at the motion of the wall with the different eyes. We don't rely completely on that, but we use it as an insight to look again at that myocardial segments to see if it is really normal or really abnormal.
There are 2 questions for our friend Fernando Morcef from Brazil.
Fernando.
The first one, in what percentage of patients do you have to manually fix the automatic border identification of the software in the 2D and 3D strain study?
Let me say, we made a lot of manual editing for the volumes and the ejection fraction. But when we go for the 3D strain, we try to manipulate as less as possible the data set. And we found that the less you edit, better result you have. Also because you just needed to identify the region of interest. You don't need to have a precise identification of the epicardium and the endocardium, but just to have the muscle inside with no pericardium into the region of interest. And most of the time, we made a lot of manual editing to get the volume and ejection fraction to be accurate as it is. And then we start again with the almost fully automated determination to go for the strain. And this will improve a lot the feasibility.
And Fernando asks you, do you use in 2D or 4D the concept of torrent wasp or anatomy and physiology? And it's possible deducting on all finding in LV strain considering wall direction and timing of the strain events, or you feel that is not necessary?
That's it's a too clever question for me. And I cannot answer. I don't use any concept, to be honest. I just look at the numbers, particularly the numbers of the longitudinal strain, and to interpret them in light of the cardiac condition, but without any pre-concept about the mechanics.
One of the last question, is possible to perform for this strain in right ventricle and in left cameras, in left auricular camera, left in right ventricle?
Yes. So I know that
in left atrial is possible.
Everything is possible, but it's not recommended because all those softwares, particularly the software for strain, have been designed specifically for the cameras. So for the right ventricular strain, I know that Toshiba has a specific software designed for the right ventricle, but so far we don't have it for GE, and also we don't have it for Tomtec. The only one I am aware of is Toshiba. And there is only one paper that has reported.
Okay. There are no more questions, so we are on time. Thank you. We have only thanks to you, our everlasting gratitude for a fantastic lecture and to answer all our questions.
Thank you for the opportunity and to deliver this talk, and particularly to meet you, even if online, Jorge, and hoping we are able soon to meet in person.
Okay, thank you a lot. Thank
you.
Ciao,
ciao.
Thank you, doctor, for your participation. Thank you, everyone.
Gracias a todos
Thank you.
Por su participación, y les quiero recordar que hoy a las 3 de la tarde siguen el webinar, va a estar la última. El doctor Marcelo Miglioranza va a hablar sobre válvula mitral, una conferencia realmente interesante, y los volvemos a encontrar a las 3 de la tarde. Y gracias por estar presente. Hasta pronto. Bye.
Ciao.